Okay, folks, so here's going to be a quick review for our Chapter 6 Anatomy and Physiology test. So what we have is a few questions from the classes to go over just briefly some specific things there. And we'll start with the respiratory system. The respiratory system, its main job is to ventilate air as well as respiration. So the parts. So we'll follow a breath through the body as we take one in. It starts in the mouth and nose, moves backwards posteriorly to the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. So it gets behind that. We're in the nasopharynx and the pharynx, the oropharynx rather. And together, the nasopharynx and the oropharynx, as we know, they are the pharynx together. We'll move inferiorly, and we're going to get to the epiglottis first. And then we get to the larynx, which is our voice box. The bottom of the larynx has the cricoid cartilage. It's that complete ring of cartilage there that separates the upper airway from the lower airway. Also holds open, basically forms the opening for the trachea. Excuse me. There as well. So inferior to the cricoid cartilage, we have the trachea. It's the windpipe. It's got 16 C-shaped cartilage rings that hold it open. And when it gets to the bottom there, it bifurcates, it splits into two, into your main stem bronchi. You have a left bronchus and a right bronchus. As soon as those enter the lungs, they divide. They start splitting and splitting more and more and more. As you can see in the picture here, that they become bronchioles. The smaller they get, they become bronchioles. And at the end of bronchioles, we have the alveoli. We also have some muscles involved here. And on this particular picture, we can see the diaphragm. Right? It's basically a horizontal sheet of muscle that separates our abdominal cavity from our chest cavity. And when it contracts, basically when it flexes, it moves downwards. And in doing so, it creates a larger space inside the chest cavity. Also, at the same time the diaphragm is moving downwards, our intercostal muscles, our muscles between our ribs, they're responsible for making our rib cage go out and up. So when we take a deep breath, our chest expands like that. That's our intercostal muscles moving those our ribs there. Now, ventilation is the primary job, and that is bringing gases in all the way down to the alveoli and taking gases all the way from the alveoli to the outside world, getting rid of those. Inhalation is an active process. That means we have to use energy, we have to use our muscles to actually inhale. Exhalation is a passive process. After we inhale, we use our muscles to make our chest cavity bigger, our diaphragm contracts and drops. We exhale, and that's just our muscles relaxing. That creates a positive pressure, and that makes the air go out. So that's the respiratory system. Again, main job is ventilation, bringing gases from the outside world, oxygen, all the way down to the alveoli, and then taking the gases at the alveoli. In this case, it's going to be carbon dioxide, and removing that from the system through exhalation. Now, another job that the respiratory system has is the alveoli are the site of respiration, where there's the exchange of gases. So the alveoli, as we all know, they're grape. They look like grape clusters, and each one of those individual grapes is covered in capillaries. So the gas exchange takes place there between the thin walls of the capillaries and the thin walls of the alveoli. The oxygen goes through and gets on the red blood cells, and then the carbon dioxide comes out of the plasma and into the alveolar space, and we exhale, and that moves out of our body. Okay. So next, we are going to tackle the nervous system. All right, so quickly go over the nervous system. We have several divisions. There are two divisions that deal with just the anatomy. The other three divisions deal with jobs. So just the anatomy, the divisions are the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and spinal cord. And we have the peripheral nervous system. These are our sensory and motor nerves. Sensory nerves run from the body back to the spinal cord, back to the brain. So if we have a sensation, let's say you put your hand on something and it feels cold, that signal will go up your sensory nerves to your spinal cord, up into the brain, where your brain will interpret that signal as something being cold. And if you want to move your hand off of there, the brain would send a signal, so move your arm down the spinal cord, out your motor nerves to where the muscles get that signal, and then start to move the hand off of that cold thing that was being touched. So sensory nerves always go from the body to the brain. Motor nerves always go from the brain to the body, always move outwards that way. So those two systems there, central and peripheral nervous systems, strictly deal with the anatomy. Now we have three systems that deal with jobs that the nervous system does. And the first is the autonomic nervous system. Now we know that sounds like automatic. So that's a good thing, because it tells us what it does. It takes care of all of those automatic functions that require the use of muscles. So it's in charge of all of our involuntary or smooth muscles. So for example, your pupils dilating or constricting is done because of the autonomic nervous system. Moving food through your digestive system is done by your autonomic nervous system. Your arteries constricting or dilating, or your airway passages, the bronchioles constricting or dilating, that's all done through the autonomic nervous system. It takes care of the automatic functions, the functions that happen without us having to think about them. They control the involuntary muscle use. Next, we have the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. What's that in a second here? All right, so we have our sympathetic nervous system, and this is responsible for our fight or flight response. The fight or flight response is basically a response, so our body is ready to go, ready to use all of our muscles right away. Normally our body, if we're going to go running somewhere, we start running, let's say we're going to run around a big building, right, or a lap around a track or something like that. Our body responds to our muscles needing more oxygen as we start running, and so the body recognizes the need of the muscles needing more oxygen, and so it gets your heart rate going faster, it gets you breathing deeper and faster, gets your blood vessels tightening up a little bit to help blood flow get places a little faster. And all of these are a response to a stimulus, right? Like we're running, right? So it is a demand and then supply system. The sympathetic nervous system, it's a supply then demand system. So a simple way to look at it is there is a threat to your life. You walk around a corner, what have you been saying? Like, there's a bear there. And your brain recognizes that you either have to run for your life or fight for your life. And so it doesn't really do us much good to have to start to fight or have to start to run away from this life threat. And then our body starts kicking in like, oh, we need more oxygen, things like that. So with a fight or flight response, that happens right away. So we get a large dump of epinephrine from our adrenal glands. And once that hits the system, several things happen. Our heart rate goes up. Our heart is beating faster and harder. Our respiratory rate goes up. We're breathing faster and more deeply. Our airways open. They go from breathing air through tubes this big to breathing air through tubes that big. Right? We get much more air on board, right? Much more oxygen on board to feed those muscles. Our blood vessels, our arteries, arterioles, they constrict a bit, right? It raises our blood pressure a little bit in doing so, among many other things that are happening in the body. So those are the major ones that are happening there in the body. Also, not to forget is our GI system. The blood gets shunted away from our GI system, right? You don't really need to digest that cheeseburger while you're fighting or running for your life. Your body recognizes this, kind of puts it on hold, shunts most of the blood that is going to the GI system other places, your brain, your lungs, your heart, your muscles, right? We need that blood to feed the oxygen to those different systems there. We don't really need it for the GI system right now. We can come back to digesting later. So that's your fight or flight response. Now, recognize that you don't need a life or death situation to enact this. It's mostly when you are emotionally attached to something. So if you're going on a date for the first time and you're really nervous, well, you're having a bit of a fight or flight response there. If you have a test that's coming up and you're nervous about that, or you're anxious about something, sometimes those can be fight or flight responses as well. If you've ever seen somebody with is nervous about something and they have a lot of nervous energy, maybe they're twiddling their fingers, tapping their toes, shuffling as they stand there, well, that's a fight or flight response. They're dealing with the dump of adrenaline in their body, that epinephrine going coursing through their system. So it's a fight or flight response. And the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for that. Next, we have the parasympathetic nervous system. This is your feed or breathe response, or your rest and relax response. This basically does a lot of opposite things that the sympathetic nervous system does. So when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, we're going to have a lot of opposite responses. So an example of this might be if over Thanksgiving you eat several plates of food and you have some apple pie and cherry pie and sweet potato pie for dessert, and then you're just laying on the couch, you don't have a lot of energy, and you just feel so full, right? You're going to be having a parasympathetic nervous system response here at this point, right? Your body recognizes that you're not going to need a lot of blood in your muscles for relaxing here. You're going to need that for the digestive process that's taking place, so a lot of your blood gets shunted down there. It's not feeding your muscles so you can go out and fight a bear or anything like that. Also, it can shunt blood towards your reproductive organs as well. Now, again, a lot of opposite responses in the body here to the parasympathetic nervous system. So our heart rate's going to drop, blood pressure is going to drop, our respiratory rate is going to drop. We get a little bit slower there as well. Our blood vessels will relax a little bit. Be as constricted, they'll relax a little bit, and our airways will also they'll be basically in a normal stage there. It's not like they're going to be closing up. So this is your feed and breathe, or rest and relax, and your parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for that. All right, so next we are going to talk about arteries and pulses. All right, so just in general, a pulse, it's that wave of pressure when the left ventricle squeezes and pushes blood out to the body throughout the arteries. There's a pressure wave coming, and we can feel that pressure wave when we palpate, touch, press down over top of an artery, and we press it down next to a harder structure. Now, it says here it can be felt by pressing an artery over a bone. Well, not all arteries are next to the bone. They're harder structures for sure. It helps with protection and things like that, but not all of them are bone. For example, the trachea. On either side of the trachea, we have the carotid arteries, bilaterally located. They're not right next to a bone, but they can be pressed down. You can feel that. So whenever you feel that bump, 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 bump for the pulse, you're feeling that pressure wave. The pulse is just bump, 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 bump. It's that pressure wave of the left ventricle contracting and pushing that blood out. Now, we have two types of pulses that we'll need to know. The first is peripheral pulses. And these are on the outer parts of the body. These are all located on our extremities. Two are on our arms and two are on our legs here that we're going to talk about. First, starting close to the core of the body, but on the outer parts. We have the brachial pulse, which we know is in the upper arm here. the artery runs next to the humerus bone. And for an adult, you kind of got to push the muscle up out of the way and then press into the bone to feel it. And we know with the brachial pulse, this is the pulse that we're going to assess when we're assessing the pulses of an infant, for example, in CPR, an infant, small toddler, things like that. Then we have the radial pulse, which is located on the wrist. This is the pulse that we're going to be checking with our patients about 99% of the time. This is the one we're going to go to, and maybe the only one we go to, but it's usually the one we go to first on our patients is that radial pulse. And it is, that artery is located, it runs right next to the radius, the bone there. So right down by the wrist, just medial to the radius is where you can find that pulse. We're all familiar with that. Now we have two in the lower extremities here. First we have the posterior tibial. This is located on the posterior aspect of your medial malleolus. Okay, so those bumps on the insides of your ankle, on the back side of those bumps is where we can feel the posterior tibial pulse. The posterior aspect of the medial malleolus. Then we also have the dorsalis pedis. This is the pulse that is on top of the foot. It's located just laterally to the tarsal bone that leads to our big toe. Okay, so just lateral, just to the outside of the tarsal bone, the metatarsal that leads to the big toe. Dorsalis pedis. Now we need to know all four of those, what they're called. And we have a couple of pulses that are they're called central pulses, and that's because they're closer to the core of the body. They're more central than the others. First, we have our carotid, which is obviously located. Carotid arteries are located bilaterally in the neck, so on either side of the trachea. And then we have the femoral pulses as well. We have one on each leg. Now, femoral pulse can be accessed and palpated, basically where the leg meets the body. In that crease in the groin, if you put your fingers there, we can feel that. Now, one of the concepts to know about pulses and these arteries and where we're feeling them is that the lower somebody's blood pressure gets, the harder it is going to be to feel a peripheral pulse. So if somebody has very low blood pressure, you may not be able to feel a radial or brachial pulse or posterior tibial or dorsalis pedis. You may have to feel for the carotid or femoral artery pulse there. Something to keep in mind, if you have a patient who's having blood pressure problems, either due to a medical condition or a traumatic episode. Let's see, 1 second. All right, and here we go with part about the blood pressure there. Okay. All right. Next, we're going to move on to the what we got here? The cardiac conduction system. So we'll do that next. Cardiac conduction. All right. For the cardiac conduction system, one thing we have to think back and remember is the type of muscle that the heart is composed of, as well as what the special property is. So the myocardium, the heart muscle, the special property that it has is called automaticity, and that is the ability for each individual heart muscle cell to not only generate its own electrical impulse, but to conduct them as well. So that means to take one from the neighbor on one side, take that electrical impulse, take it from the neighbor on one side, and pass it along to the neighbor on the other side. Now, that's important because as the electrical impulse hits each muscle cell, it causes it to contract. And so that is important to remember as we're going through this. Now, if you look at number 1 here, that's the sinoatrial node, the SA node. That's the primary pacemaker of the heart. That is what is telling your heart how to beat, basically its rate. It likes to have an adult heart beat between 60 and 100 beats per minute, the SA node. Okay. It also sends out the electrical impulse to the rest of the heart. Okay, so 60 to 100 times per minute, it's sending out that electrical impulse that makes the heart squeeze and contract. It makes that heart beat. Well, if we're looking at number one here, and we see the sinoatrial node, we can see the little pathways coming off of those. There's even one going all the way over to the left atrium with its own pathways there. So the electrical signal travels down in a very orderly fashion down these pathways and throughout the atria. And as it does that, it's spreading that electrical signal out through the myocardium, each individual heart muscle cell. And once that electricity hits that cell, and then it gets passed on to the next one, that cell squeezes, it contracts, it flexes basically. And so the way that it's spread through the atria, it gives us a nice orderly squeeze. It gives us a real orderly squeeze. So it spreads it out nice and orderly, and that allows the atria to squeeze and push the blood down into the ventricles in a nice orderly fashion. Now, as we know, electricity travels incredibly fast, and the heart really isn't that big. And so if the SA node lets go of that electrical impulse, it could travel all the way down to the bottom of the heart in a split second, and that would cause our heart to have the top and the bottom to squeeze at the same time. Now, the ventricles on the bottom, they can't fill up with the blood that's coming from the atria if they're also squeezing. So we have to have the squeezing motions offset, right? It can't be the same time. It won't work like that. So the top has to squeeze and drops the blood into the bottom, then the bottom squeezes the blood out of the heart. The atria squeeze, pushes the blood down to the ventricles squeeze, pushes the blood out to the rest of the body. It has to be done orderly like that, otherwise it won't work. That's why you get the sound of your heartbeat when you're listening to it through a stethoscope, right? Bump, 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 bump. Make sense? I hope so. So we can't have the electrical signal going too quickly. And so we come down to number two, the atrioventricular node. Its primary job here is going to be act like a crossing guard. It tells that electrical signal, hold up here. We got to wait. You can't go rushing through. So it holds up that electrical signal. It allows the atria to contract, push the blood down into the ventricles. Once the blood is down there and received into the ventricles, it lets the electrical signal go, and that spreads down through the number three, the AV bundle, atrioventricular bundle of His. And the pathways diverge, it bifurcates, it splits into bundle branches, and then it gets down to the apex of the heart, and it goes up and around the sides, up and around those Purkinje fibers. Again, this is really nice and orderly fashion, spreading that electrical signal out as it's touching basically each and every individual heart muscle cell, causing them to contract. And that way we get a nice orderly squeeze from the ventricles at the bottom, squeezing that blood out there. So we have our sinoatrial node, primary pacemaker of the heart, likes to keep the heart beating 60 to 100 beats per minute. The AV node, number two there on the screen, its primary job is the crossing guard. It holds up that electrical signal until the atria can squeeze and drop the blood down into the ventricles. The secondary job is, it's got another job, it's the secondary pacemaker. So if the sinoatrial node, the SA node gets sick, damaged in some way, it'll take over. And the rate it likes the heart to beat at is between 40 and 60 beats per minute. And again, we have the AV bundle, the bundle branches moving through down and through the interventricular septum, and then we come out to the Purkinje fibers. Again, nice and orderly. We're using automaticity in our favor, spreading out the electrical signal in a nice orderly fashion so we can get a good squeeze on top and a good squeeze on the bottom. Just a quick overview there on the cardiac conduction system. That's all that I had there for you folks for that. So if you have any questions here for our test coming up, either tomorrow for A-Day folks or Friday for B-Day folks, please shoot me an email. I'll be hyper aware of your emails coming through in the evenings, and I will do my absolute best to get back to you as soon as possible. But don't be afraid to ask a question, even if it's something that we've gone over multiple times before. Ask the question. Let's get it straight so we can get it right on the test. All right, guys. Thanks, and good luck on the test. Let me know if you have any questions whatsoever. Thank you.